The moment elder races discovered humans had tamed apex predators as household pets for fun. Part 2. The briefing that should have happened earlier. The meeting room in the Colonial Administration Building was comfortable and well lit. There was a long table with chairs on both sides, a large display screen on one wall, and a tray of small food items in the center that no one touched. The air was slightly cool, which humans apparently preferred when conducting formal discussions. Velkara sat with her hands folded on the table and asked, in the measured tone of someone who was working very hard to remain calm, for what she called a full biological clarification. Thomas, beside her, had his scanner on the table in front of him and had not put it away. Owen Garrett sat across from them and sent a message from his small communication device. 10 minutes later, the door opened, and a woman walked in carrying a data tablet and a cup of hot liquid that steamed slightly. She set both on the table and sat down next to Owen with the easy, comfortable manner of someone walking into a room she had been in many times before. Her name was Dr. Nina Holt. She was a xenobiologist by training and had spent 7 years working on interspecies cultural exchange programs. She was compact, with short red hair, and a pair of reading glasses she wore more out of habit than necessity. She had explained things to confused people many times over the years. She had a particular kind of patience, not the kind that was tired or annoyed, but the kind that was simply well practiced. She looked at Velkara and Thomas for a moment, looked at Owen, and Owen gave a small nod. "Right," she said. "So, animals." She pulled up the display screen from her tablet. She started with dogs, because that was where the afternoon's confusion had started, and because it was, in her professional opinion, the best place for a clear-eyed overview of the situation. She explained that dogs were, by biological classification, members of the same family as wolves. She walked through the basic anatomy in plain terms. She described the musculature, the jaw structure, the sensory capabilities, smell in particular, which she noted was many tens of thousands of times more sensitive than a human's. She explained that they were, in the technical language of ecological science, apex predators, which meant that in their natural environment they sat at the top of the food chain with no natural predators of their own. She said all of this in the same tone she might use to describe cloud formations. She explained that humans had been living alongside dogs for somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years, depending on which scientific study you referenced, and that over that time, through selective breeding and close shared living, dogs had become something genuinely different from their wild ancestors. Not physically less dangerous, she was clear about that, but socially and behaviorally bonded to humans in a way that was, as far as the scientific community could tell, completely mutual. They didn't just get used to us, she said. They actually like us. They evolved to like us. There's neurological evidence for it. When a dog looks at its owner, both of them release bonding hormones, the same ones that bond parents to their children. Thomas looked up from his scanner very slowly. "Both of them," he said. "Both of them," Nina confirmed. There was a pause. She kept going. The catalog on the screen scrolled forward. Large breeds, small breeds, working breeds that had been specifically developed over centuries to hunt, track, and corner prey animals that were themselves dangerous. There were dogs bred to hold bears, she mentioned at one point, in the same tone one might mention a regional weather pattern. Velkara asked, quietly, how large the largest breeds grew. Nina told her. She gave the weight range and the shoulder height, and included, because Thomas seemed to need numbers, a rough estimate of bite force for the larger working breeds. The number she gave was sufficient to fracture the structural support beams of a standard diplomatic transport. There was a silence that lasted several seconds. Thomas spoke first. "Dr. Nina Holt," he said carefully, "the animal we observed this afternoon, on the street, was it in a subdued state? Some form of chemical calming?" Nina looked genuinely puzzled. "No," she said. "Duchess was just on her afternoon walk." She was probably a little tired, actually. Why? Thomas turned his scanner around and slid it across the table. Nina looked at the readings. She scrolled through them with one finger, nodding slowly. Yeah, she said, that's about right. Velkara made a sound. Her translator rendered it as involuntary distress vocalization. Owen, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, added helpfully that his own dog, a 7-year-old named Biscuit, had once pulled him off his feet and dragged him across a park for a distance of roughly 40 feet, because he had spotted a squirrel on the far side of a fence. Owen described this with the warm, rueful smile of a man recounting an old and beloved inconvenience. Thomas stared at him. And you still keep this animal? Of course, Owen said, as if the alternative had never once occurred to him. Nina moved the catalog forward. She described them as small, solitary hunters with retractable claws, a bite designed to sever spinal connections, and a personality that she characterized with a slight smile as fully independent. They were kept as household companions by an enormous number of humans. They slept on human beds, they sat on human laps. She noted that, unlike dogs, cats had not been selectively bred to be particularly obedient or affectionate. They made their own choices about the relationship. Velkara asked what happened when a cat decided it no longer wanted to be held. It bites you, Nina said simply. And then? And then you put it down and it glares at you for a few hours, and you apologize. The silence that followed this statement was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. Nina kept going. She moved through ferrets, which were fast and sharp-toothed, and seemed to find chaos enjoyable. She mentioned large birds that could remove fingers. She paused briefly on a section about reptiles, and then, in the measured tone of a professional delivering information without editorializing, mentioned that certain humans kept fully grown Nile crocodiles in private enclosures on their property, and that one individual in the southern continent of Earth had named his crocodile and referred to it in multiple recorded interviews as "my boy." Thomas had stopped taking notes. He was simply looking at the screen. Nina reached the section covering domesticated wolves and hybrid wolf dogs. She kept it brief. The numbers and photographs spoke for themselves. When she closed the catalog and set her tablet down, the room was very quiet. The small food items on the tray were untouched. The steaming drink had gone cold. Velkara sat still for a long moment. Then she straightened slightly and asked the only question she had left. Dr. Nina Holt, in your professional assessment, are human children regularly exposed to animals of this category as a normal part of their development? Nina nodded. Yeah, generally speaking, most children who grow up with pets start interacting with them pretty young, dogs especially. It's considered good for them, teaches empathy, responsibility, emotional regulation. She paused, then added, there's actually a lot of research suggesting kids who grow up with dogs are healthier and more socially confident. Thomas looked at the closed catalog on the screen. Then he looked at his scanner. Then he looked at Owen Garrett, who was checking a message on his communication device, with the serene inattention of a man who did not see anything unusual about this conversation at all. Thomas filed 3 formal incident reports before dinner. None of them described anything that had actually gone wrong. They were, entirely and specifically, preemptive. What Deathworlders look like without a leash. The Valthari world of Kethorum was a staging ground. It sat at the edge of what the Dominion considered its operational buffer zone, a wide slice of space that the Valthari had been slowly filling with supply depots, refueling stations, and troop installations over the last decade. From Kethorum, Dominion forces could reach a dozen human frontier systems within 72 hours. It had been chosen carefully for exactly that reason. It was the long arm of the Dominion's reach, and the Valthari High Command considered it one of their most valuable pieces of infrastructure. The human fleet arrived at Kethorum on a Wednesday. There was no formal declaration of engagement. There was no warning shot. There was no period of circling at safe distance while communication channels were opened, and diplomatic language was exchanged. The fleet simply came in from 4 directions at the same time, which was not how fleets were supposed to do it, because coordinating 4 simultaneous approach vectors across that kind of distance required a level of timing that most military planners considered impractical. Humanity had practiced it for 3 months in simulation before anyone outside the war room had even known what was coming. It was quiet and invisible, and when it was over, Kethorum was essentially alone, cut off, shouting into a void that could not hear it. Then the rest of the fleet came in. The Velthari commanders sent a ceasefire request through diplomatic channels at hour 4. It was received by the human fleet's communication officer, logged in the official record as received, and then placed into a folder that no one opened. A second request came at hour 9. It was also received, also logged, also placed into the same folder. The Velthari had not expected this. In every conflict they had studied, the ceasefire channel was the beginning of the end, the moment when both sides started feeling out where the deal would be. The ceasefire channel was the door you knocked on when you wanted to start going home. Nobody came to the door. This was the detail that began to move through the conclave like a cold current. Not the scale of the assault, not the precision of the tactics, not even the speed of it. The detail that made other species go quiet in their council rooms and speak in lower voices than usual was the disregard for the ceasefire requests. Because that meant that whatever the Velthari offered next, it would not matter. It meant the outcome had already been decided, and human forces were simply in the process of making it real. On the ground at Kethorum, Captain Lena Park was leading the assault on the surface defense grid. Lena had been in the service for 12 years. She was from a city in the southern part of North America, where summers were long and hot, and people had a reputation for being patient and direct in roughly equal measure. She was both of those things. She was also, at this specific moment in time, a person who had lost people, specific named known people, in the strikes on the 14 colony worlds, and who was moving through the operation with the kind of stillness that her soldiers found steadying, and that the Velthari opposition found deeply unnerving. They had expected something different from human ground forces. Their intelligence briefings on human combat psychology had emphasized emotional volatility, grief, rage, the tendency to make mistakes under extreme stress. They had prepared for an enemy that might fight harder than expected, but would be erratic, driven by feeling, likely to push too far or not far enough, depending on what was happening in the moment. What they got was Lena Park moving in controlled lines through the installation, giving clear orders in a calm voice, adjusting to obstacles without panic, taking losses and continuing forward without hesitation. She felt everything. It sat in her chest like a stone the whole time. But there is a kind of grief that does not make you chaotic. There is a kind that makes you very, very focused. The Velthari had not planned for that kind. Her unit reached the main grid control center in the early afternoon. The installation commander attempted to negotiate surrender terms. Lena listened to the offer, told him it was accepted for the personnel in the room, and then kept going. At the conclave, the mood was shifting in a way that had no good name for it. The Dressy Collective, a people known for careful political calculation and very little open sentiment, sent a private message to Delegate Priya Lawson, requesting to know if humanity would consider pausing operations for a negotiation window. Priya received the message, read it, wrote back a short and courteous reply. She thanked them for their concern, said she understood why they were asking, and explained that the time for that kind of conversation had passed. She was not cold about it. She was not rude. She was the same Priya Lawson who had spent 15 years building relationships in that chamber, who remembered birthdays and asked after families and brought small gifts from Earth when she visited. None of that had changed. But the answer was no, and it was a no that could not be moved. The Urvathi synthesis, who were the oldest civilization in the conclave and who had not fought a war in 6,000 years, sent their eldest voice speaker to Earth itself to ask for restraint. This was not a small thing. The elder, whose name in the Urvathi language took several minutes to say out loud, was one of the most respected figures in known space, and the journey from their homeworld was difficult for someone of his age. He arrived on Earth and was received with every courtesy that humanity knew how to offer. He was given comfortable quarters and good food, and was seen by doctors who made sure his particular biology was being looked after. He was treated well in every possible way. Then he sat with the Human Joint Council and made his case. He was an old being and a wise one, and his words were thoughtful and full of the long perspective that comes from a civilization that had watched many terrible things happen and come out the other side. He spoke for 2 hours. The council listened to every word. At the end, General Cross thanked him sincerely and told him that humanity appreciated everything he had said and everything he had crossed to come here to say it. He said it the same way he said most things, quietly, without anger, with the flat finality of a decision that was not going to be revisited. The Urvathi elder returned home and told his people what he had seen and heard. He told them about the way he had been treated, with warmth, with patience, with real care. He told them that the humans had been genuinely kind to him the entire time. His people listened to this, and many of them were surprised, because kindness had not been what they were expecting to hear about. Then they thought about it a little longer, and they realized that the kindness was somehow the most frightening part of all. Back on the Iron Gate, Nathan Cole was 3 days into the campaign. His ship had been involved in 6 separate engagements. The tactical logs were clean and thorough, and said very little about what it felt like to be inside them. Zoe Harmon kept the station running at a level of efficiency that would have been impressive under normal conditions, and was almost unnatural under these. She slept 4 hours a night, and ate at her station, and did not complain about either of those things. One evening, or what passed for evening in the middle of deep space, Nathan found her sitting in the observation bay, looking at nothing in particular. He sat down near her. They stayed there for a while, without talking. After a long time, Zoe said, "I keep thinking about how long we waited." Nathan did not answer immediately. "How many times we stepped back," she said. "How many times we let it go." He looked at the stars outside the viewport. "Yeah," he said. "And now we're here," she said. Neither of them said anything else for a while. There was not much else to say. The thing that was happening was the thing that was happening, and they were part of it, and there was no clean way to feel about that, and no version of the conversation that made it easier. They sat there, together, 2 people who had spent their whole careers trying to make the universe a safer and more reasonable place, now doing the opposite, because the other thing had stopped working, and there was nothing left to try. Eventually they went back to work. There was still a great deal of it to do. The moment elder races discovered humans had tamed apex predators as household pets for fun. Part 4. The Conclave convenes. The report that Ambassador Velkara submitted to the Galactic Conclave upon returning to Sorathan space was 63 pages long. This was not, by galactic diplomatic standards, an unusually long document. Senior reports from major cultural visits often ran much longer. What made this one unusual was not its length. What made it unusual was that the senior archivist who processed it, a Sorathan male named Keldaris, who had been cataloging diplomatic documents for 90 years and had developed the unshakable calm of someone who had read everything, stopped 3 times while processing it, put it down, and then picked it up again. He later told a colleague that it was the most remarkable document he had handled since the report about the species that used neutron star radiation as a cooking method. He said it with the look of a man who was no longer entirely sure which of the 2 reports was more concerning. The conclave distributed the document to 11 member civilizations within the week. The responses came in stages, and they were, without exception, some version of the same initial reaction. Disbelief, followed by a request for verification, followed by a second, quieter disbelief that hit harder once the verification was confirmed. The Drionic Collective responded first. They submitted a formal biological inquiry requesting a complete genetic and neurological workup on the domesticated canine species, including comparative analysis between modern domesticated dogs and their wild wolf ancestors. They also submitted a separate inquiry asking whether the exposure of human children to apex predator class animals was standard developmental practice across all human communities, or whether the instances observed by Thomas represented unusual edge cases in an otherwise cautious population. The response from Dr. Nina Holt, submitted on behalf of the New Cascadia Colonial Scientific Board, was clear. The exposure was standard. It was, in fact, actively encouraged. She included a supporting file containing 147 photographs of human infants and toddlers in physical contact with dogs of various breeds and sizes. Several of the photographs showed sleeping children, asleep on or directly beside large dogs, in positions that made Thomas, who reviewed the file personally, sit very still for a long time. Nina had included a caption on one of the photographs. It read, "Sunday morning. Classic." The Drionic Inquiry Board read the word classic 4 times and forwarded the file to their Psychological Research Division with a note that said, essentially, "Please look at this." The Uvari hegemony took longer to respond, but when they did, they responded with characteristic directness. The Uvari were nearly 6,000 years old as a spacefaring civilization. They were proud, precise, and deeply serious about ecological management. They had, over their long history, developed what they considered a sophisticated and responsible philosophy about the relationship between intelligent species and the dangerous animals that shared their worlds. The philosophy, summarized simply, was, identify the dangerous ones, contain them, study them from a safe distance, and never, under any circumstances, give them a reason to associate you with food. They sent a small delegation to Earth. They specifically requested access to a location that Velkara's report had described, but which the Uvari delegation leader, a seasoned elder named Korath 7, had read 3 times in growing disbelief. The location was described in the report as a public outdoor space where humans bring their dogs to run and socialize off-leash. The human term for this location, the report noted, was a dog park. Korath 7 had commanded military operations. He had personally overseen the stabilization of 3 border systems during periods of significant unrest. He was not by any measure easily impressed or easily rattled. He had agreed to the visit with the measured confidence of someone who had seen many strange things, and expected this to be merely one more. He arrived at the park on a clear morning in early spring. There were, at the time of arrival, 22 dogs present in the open area behind the low fence. They were of varying sizes and breeds. None of them were leashed. They were running, wrestling with each other, chasing objects that their human owners threw for them, digging briefly in the grass, and generally moving through the space with the free, energetic confidence of animals that had no concept of restraint. Several of them, the larger ones in particular, were running at speeds that Korath 7's aide quietly measured and logged without comment. The humans standing around the perimeter of the park were by any observable standard not concerned. They were talking to one another. Some were looking at small screens. One older man was sitting on a bench reading a paper book. A young woman named Laura Finch, her name was visible on a small tag attached to her dog's collar, which the delegation noted and catalogued, was throwing a flat disc across the open grass with a relaxed, practiced motion. It watched the disc leave her hand, launched itself off the ground with all 4 legs simultaneously, caught the disc cleanly at the height of its jump, landed without breaking stride, and came sprinting back across the park with the disc in its mouth and its entire face expressing something that could only be called pure, uncomplicated joy. It dropped the disc at Laura Finch's feet and looked up at her. She laughed and picked it up and threw it again. Korath 7 watched this happen 4 times. He stood completely still. His aide stood beside him and did not speak because his aide was also watching and had temporarily forgotten to take notes. After the 4th throw, Korath 7 said, very quietly, "They did not engineer this through technology." His aide confirmed that was correct. The domestication process was entirely biological, conducted over thousands of years through selective preference. And the animal, Korath 7 said slowly, enjoys this activity. It is not performing it out of conditioning or fear. His aide confirmed that the neurological and behavioral research was consistent on this point. The enjoyment appeared genuine. And the humans, Korath 7 continued, in the tone of a man reviewing the pieces of something he was still assembling, consider this ordinary. They bring their children here. He looked across the park. There were in fact 2 small children present, sitting on the grass near the fence. A medium-sized brown dog was lying between them, with the patient, happy tolerance of an animal that had decided these children were its specific responsibility, and was pleased about it. Korath 7 stood in the dog park for 40 minutes. He watched Laura Finch throw the disc 11 more times. He watched the brown dog follow the 2 children from one end of the fence to the other. He watched an old man's small white dog climb onto the bench beside him, sit down like a person, and be scratched behind the ear, without either the old man or the dog treating this as anything other than completely normal. Then he turned to his aide and said something that the aide included, verbatim, in the official mission report back to the Yuvari hegemony. "We have been afraid of humans," Korath 7 said, "for the wrong reasons." The report reached the Hegemon Council 4 days later. The council read it in full session. Then they read Valkera's original conclave report again, which most of them had initially reviewed with polite skepticism. Then they sat in silence for a while. One council member, toward the end of the session, asked a question that no one in the room could immediately answer. She asked how it was possible that a species capable of forming this kind of bond with an apex predator had taken so long to be taken seriously by the rest of the galaxy. Nobody had a good answer. The question stayed in the meeting record, unanswered, and was still being referenced in academic papers 3 decades later. Thomas, back on Drionic space, filed his final formal report on the new Cascadia visit. It was thorough, well-organized, and cited 17 separate pieces of supporting evidence. At the very end, in the section reserved for personal observations, he wrote one sentence. It said, "I think about Biscuit more than is professionally appropriate." The moment elder races discovered humans had tamed apex predators as household pets for fun. Part 5. What it actually meant. The formal cultural symposium was scheduled for 6 months after Valkera's report had circulated through the conclave. 6 months was, for the elder races, an unusually fast turnaround for any kind of formal gathering. The Sorathan Empire alone typically required 8 months of pre-session correspondence just to agree on the table arrangement. The fact that 11 civilizations had managed to coordinate a full symposium in half a year said something about how much the report had affected people, though no one said it out loud. The venue was a neutral diplomatic station near the edge of conclave space. It was a large, well-maintained facility that had hosted dozens of significant gatherings over its long history, including the Boundary Accord of the Third Age and the original negotiations that had brought 2 warring civilizations to a peace that had now lasted 800 years. It was, in other words, a place accustomed to wait. The human delegation arrived on the 2nd day of the setup period, which surprised several of the station staff who had not expected any delegation to be early. Humans, the general consensus had been, were a young species with young habits, and the elder races had quietly assumed they would need to be reminded of the timeline more than once. They were not reminded. They arrived ahead of schedule, set up their materials efficiently, and were seen in the common areas that same evening, talking comfortably with junior staff from half a dozen different species while sharing a meal. He had been included in his capacity as a cultural liaison, which was a role that suited him well, because the core of the job was simply talking to people and making them feel at ease. And Owen was very good at that. He brought because he had been told personal items were welcome in the delegation workspace, and because he genuinely thought it might help in ways he could not fully explain, a small framed photograph of Biscuit. The photo had been taken on a Sunday afternoon. Biscuit was mid-yawn in it, eyes squeezed shut, mouth open wide, showing all his teeth, ears pulled back, looking entirely ridiculous and completely at peace. It was not a dignified photograph by any standard. It was, however, an honest one. Owen placed it on the table during the opening session. No one in the human delegation commented on it, because to them it was simply a photograph of a dog. 3 separate alien delegations quietly photographed it during the first recess. 2 of those photographs appeared, years later, in academic publications about the symposium. The first day of sessions covered standard ground. Species representatives gave formal overviews of their civilization's positions on interspecies cultural exchange. There were presentations on communication protocols and discussions about how to handle biological materials in shared environments. It was thorough and professional, and largely what everyone had expected going in. The second day was different. The session organizers had set aside time in the afternoon for what the agenda called open cultural reflection. This was, in practice, a politely structured way of allowing the questions that everyone had been carrying since Velkara's report to finally be spoken out loud. A Sorathan cultural philosopher named Rez Vile opened the reflection period. She was 340 years old and had written extensively on the nature of empathy between species. She was not a diplomat and did not speak like one. She spoke like someone who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally organized it well enough to say it clearly. She talked about the history of interspecies relationships in the galaxy. She described how most civilizations, when they encountered dangerous animals on their worlds, had responded in the way that any sensible intelligence would respond, with caution, then control, then distance. The dangerous ones were studied, managed, fenced off, or in some cases eliminated. This was not cruelty. It was reason. It was how intelligent life protected itself. Then she talked about humans. She noted that the animal most commonly kept as a companion by the human species was, by every measurable biological standard, a predator. Not a large one, by galactic scale, but a genuine one. An animal with real teeth, real strength, real instincts that had been shaped over millions of years for hunting. And not a docile, slow, easily managed creature, but one that was fast and smart and capable of making its own decisions. And humans, she said, had not responded to this animal with caution, control, or distance. They had responded with something else entirely. She described what the delegations had seen in the footage from Earth and New Cascadia. Dogs sleeping in children's beds. Dogs riding in cars with their heads out the windows. Dogs sitting in the same chairs their owners sat in. Dogs being talked to in soft voices, being given names, being mourned when they died. Humans building entire industries around the comfort and health and happiness of these animals. Humans taking their dogs to doctors and to parks and on holidays. Humans, in recorded interviews, describing their dogs not as property or tools, but as members of the family. She was quiet for a moment after she said that last part. Then she said that what had confused the elder races, initially, was that they had looked at this through the lens of risk assessment. They had looked at the jaw strength and the speed and the instincts, and they had asked, Why are they not afraid? And that had been the wrong question. The right question, she said, was how did this happen? And the answer, which was available in the biological record, in the archaeological record, in thousands of years of human art and story and writing, was that humans and dogs had not been brought together by utility alone. They had been brought together and kept together across thousands of generations and every change of circumstance that history could produce, by something that both species apparently felt and neither could have put into words. The hall was very quiet when she finished. In the back of the room, Owen Garrett was looking at the photograph of Biscuit on the table in front of him. The dog was mid-yawn, eyes shut, completely oblivious to the fact that his photograph was sitting in a diplomatic symposium hall attended by 11 civilizations, on a space station that had hosted some of the most significant conversations in galactic history. A young delegate from the Drianic Collective was sitting 2 seats to Owen's left. She was small, with smooth, pale skin and the wide, careful eyes of her people, and she had been listening to Resvale with an expression that was hard to name. After a moment, she leaned slightly toward Owen and nodded at the photograph. "What is his name?" she asked quietly. "Biscuit," Owen said. She looked at the photograph for a moment, at the ridiculous wide-open yawn, the scrunched-up eyes, the big dumb happy face of a dog who had been lying on a warm couch on a Sunday afternoon with absolutely nothing to worry about. "He seems," she said slowly, picking the word with care, "happy." Owen looked at the photo and smiled, not a diplomatic smile, just a real one. "He really is," he said. "He really, genuinely is." It was a small exchange, 2 sentences. It lasted about 15 seconds, and neither of them thought much of it afterward. But something shifted in the room during those 15 seconds that no formal address had managed to move, and people felt it, even if they could not name it precisely. Not fear. The elder races had fear of humanity, well covered. Not respect, either, though they were getting there. Not the polite, careful, mutual tolerance that civilizations build between themselves when they have decided that coexistence is more practical than conflict. Something older than any of that. Something that cut below language and politics and history to the part of any living mind that simply recognizes warmth when it is present, and responds to it without needing to think it through first. Resvale, still at the front of the room, watched the small exchange happen. She watched the young Drainic delegate look at the photograph for another moment, before sitting back in her chair. She watched Owen Garrett rest his hand lightly on the frame of the photo, the same easy, unthinking way a person rests a hand on something familiar and loved. She had spent 340 years studying the question of what connected different kinds of minds across the enormous distance of being different kinds of minds. She thought she had just watched a small, quiet answer to it. The humans, for their part, did not seem to notice that anything remarkable had happened. Owen was already looking toward the front of the room, where the next speaker was preparing to begin. He had tucked the photograph slightly to the side of the table, so it would not block anyone's view. This was, Resvale thought, entirely typical. In her experience, the humans never noticed. They moved through genuinely extraordinary moments with the comfortable ease of people who had simply never learned to be surprised by the things they carried with them. The warmth, the stubbornness, the habit of loving things fiercely and without apology, including things that could, technically, bite their arm off. Maybe that was the answer, she thought. Maybe that had always been the answer. She gathered her notes and sat down. At the back of the room, Biscuit's photograph sat on the table in the quiet light of the station, yawning at the galaxy, unbothered by all of it. The moment elder races discovered humans had tamed apex predators as household pets for fun. Part 1. First Contact Pleasantries. The Galactic Conclave had existed for 4,000 years. In that time, its member civilizations had seen collapsing stars, had watched new species crawl out of their homeworlds and reach for the sky, and had negotiated peace between races that communicated through sound frequencies no other species could even hear. They believed, with reasonable confidence, that very little in the universe could genuinely surprise them anymore. They were wrong. Ambassador Velkara of the Sarithan Empire had been a diplomat for over 200 years. She was tall, graceful, and covered in smooth, iridescent skin that shifted color slightly depending on her mood. Her species had developed faster than light travel long before humans had invented the wheel. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most experienced and unshakable diplomatic minds in the known galaxy. She was not prepared for New Cascadia. The colony world was a pleasant place, she would admit that much. It was warm and green, with wide streets and open markets, and a soft yellow sun that reminded her, a little, of the paintings she had seen in the human cultural files. The air smelled of something sweet. The buildings were modest but well kept. Children ran between the market stalls, laughing at things Velkara's translator could not quite catch. Her aide for the visit was a young male named Fomis, from the Draionic Collective. He was thin, blue-gray in color, with 6 fingers on each hand, and eyes that could rotate independently. He was considered extremely intelligent, even among his own people, and he had a habit of scanning everything around him with a small handheld device and writing notes about what he found. He had already filled 2 logs since landing. Their human liaison met them at the landing pad. His name was Owen Garrett. He was a mid-level colonial diplomat, average height for a human, with dark hair going gray at the sides, and the kind of easy smile that people develop when they spend a lot of time talking to strangers for a living. He was carrying a small bag over one shoulder, and he walked toward them with his hand already extended in the human greeting gesture. "Welcome to New Cascadia," he said warmly. "I hope the journey was comfortable." Velkara performed the greeting as protocol required. She noted, as most elder race diplomats did when meeting humans in person, how physically unimpressive they were up close. Soft skin, no natural armor, limited sensory range, slow reflexes by galactic standards. Their lifespan was short enough that a Sarithan child would outlive 3 full generations of them. And yet here they were, barely 300 years out from their first warp-capable ship, sitting at the same diplomatic tables as civilizations that had been sailing between stars since before humans had written language. It was, Velkara had always thought, a little embarrassing. For the rest of the galaxy, she meant. Owen led them down the main boulevard of the colonial capital, pointing out buildings and explaining the city's layout. The market to the left had been established by the original settlers. The administration building at the end of the road was where the afternoon meetings would be held. The tall structure on the hill was a school. He said all of this in a comfortable, unhurried way, as if he were giving a tour to family visiting from out of town. Velkara was listening politely and watching the street. The city felt calm, safe even. There were families everywhere. Old people sitting outside small shops, workers carrying things between buildings, the general soft noise of a community going about its day. Then she saw it. It was moving along the far side of the street, low to the ground, but wide through the chest and shoulders. Its legs were thick, and its paws were large. Its head was broad, and its jaw, Velkara's eyes went immediately to the jaw, was built in a way that spoke very clearly to anyone with any biological instinct at all. This was not the jaw of an animal that ate plants. This was not even the jaw of an animal that ate small things. This jaw was engineered by millions of years of evolution for one purpose, and that purpose was ending other living things efficiently. Its eyes were a deep, steady gold. It moved with the calm of something that had never once, in its entire evolutionary history, needed to worry about what was behind it. It was attached to a thin, woven cord. The other end of the cord was held loosely, almost casually, in the hand of a small human girl. She was no older than 8. She was skipping. She was pulling something from her jacket pocket and feeding it to the animal piece by piece, and the animal was taking each piece very gently from her fingers. Velkara stopped walking. Thomas, who had already raised his scanner, was completely silent. Owen noticed that they had both stopped and turned around. He looked at the girl and the animal, then back at his guests, and his expression shifted into the particular look of a person who has suddenly remembered that something completely ordinary to him might not be ordinary to everyone. You probably haven't seen one of those before. What? Velkara said, very carefully. Is that creature? That's a Rottweiler, Owen said. Her name's Duchess, I think. She belongs to the family in that building over there. Good dog. The kid walks her every afternoon. Velkara looked at the child again. The girl had now stopped skipping and was crouching down beside the animal, wrapping both arms around its thick neck and pressing her face into the fur there. The animal stood still, patient and calm, and its thick tail was moving slowly from side to side. The child, Velkara said, is touching it. Yeah, Owen said, kids love dogs. His face had taken on a very particular expression, the expression of someone who has just read something and is reading it a second time to make sure they read it correctly the first time. Owen Garrett, he said quietly, this animal's jaw strength alone is enough to— Yeah, they're strong dogs, Owen agreed pleasantly. Great family pets though, loyal as anything. Duchess especially, she's very gentle with kids. The girl stood up, gave the animal's head one more pat, and resumed her walk, the cord swinging loosely in her hand. Duchess walked beside her with steady, unhurried steps, gold eyes moving calmly over the street ahead. Velkara watched them until they turned a corner and disappeared from sight. She stood on the boulevard of the colonial capital of New Cascadia, 4,000 years of galactic history behind her, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt genuinely, completely uncertain. Owen Garrett, she said slowly, how many of those animals are there on this planet? Owen thought about it for a moment. On New Cascadia? Probably a few thousand. On Earth? He smiled. Hundreds of millions. Neither Velkara nor Thomas said anything for a long moment. Owen adjusted the strap of his bag and nodded toward the administration building at the end of the road. Should we keep going? The meeting room should be set up by now. Thomas was still looking at his scanner, and the color of his skin, usually a steady blue-gray, had gone noticeably pale.